Hello YouTube, this is Umelzo3. In the previous lesson, we were talking more about matrices, which are basically a collection, like a list or tuple of lists or tuples, okay? And each of those lists or tuples have to hold the same number of ints or floats, right? So we're talking about basically a rectangular grid, where each of the entries in the grid, each of the elements in those individual lists or tuples within the matrix is a number, like an int or float. And we talked about operations that we can have, like the minimum or maximum element. So presumably we could be talking about the minimum or maximum element of anything that's sortable. And we could be talking about adding two matrices together as long as the elements can be added together. And the way that you would implement that for any class is through the add magic method. And we talked about that in previous videos, but I wanted to do a content review. So we know that frozen sets are immutable sets, which can have no duplicate elements, and there are no adding or removing elements because they're immutable. And the call magic method allows you to define x of args for some instance x of a class and some arbitrary collection of arguments that you're passing into the instance, treating it as though it were a function. And then there's a contains magic method, which allows you to define y and x for some element y and instance x of your class. And then if you write if name equals main, so here we are on line 126, right? And that allows you to run your module as a script. And we've talked about that for a few videos now. And then exec of x executes string x, which must contain executable Python code. So like treating x like inside of that string, there are Python instructions, maybe assigning a variable, maybe printing something, maybe calling a function. But that's what you would do in the context of that string. And then you would say y equals iter of x creates an iterable on the data structure x, and then you could call next of y to get the next element in the iterable in the data structure. And then in the previous video, we talked about eval of x. So what that does is it returns the literal value of the expression or variable within the string x. So if you say eval of and then double quotes a, it'll look for a variable called a and return the value of that variable. So we're going to review that in this video. And then the sum of two matrices sums each entry in each corresponding row and column, and it can be implemented using a static method. And you can find the minimum entry, the maximum entry, or any of the four corner elements. And then we can also find the number of entries in the matrix, which is given by the number of rows times the number of columns. And then a transpose of a matrix, which is the rows and columns of rows and columns, okay, of a matrix. So what we're going to do, we're in if underscore underscore name underscore underscore equals equals double quotes underscore underscore main underscore underscore double quotes colon. My string equals waterfall in the summer, and we have some mixed punctuation here, right? Like some letters are capital. It looks like there are about 7 capital letters, right? W, T, F, L, L, S, and U. So 7 capital letters. But otherwise, it just says waterfall in the summer. And then it says my capital letters equals 0. My iterator equals iter of my string. For T in range of length of my string times 100. So this is kind of interesting. So normally we see range of length of some iterable, but here it says range of, and then length of the iterable times 100. So it seems like this loop is going to iterate a lot of times. So within the context of it, it says if T equals length of my string, break. Okay, so once T reaches some value, so presumably we're going to be calling next of my iterator some number of times, and the number of times to call next of my iterator and assign the result of that to my character is going to be the length of my string, however many characters there are, because that's when we break out of this loop, right? This range of length of my string times 100 is not going to do it. It's the length of my string it's breaking out that's going to do it. But we're going to say my character equals next of my iterator. If it's not the case that my character dot upper equals my character, or my character equals space, pass and then continue. So then we would just end the current iteration of the loop, okay? But otherwise, I guess if it's not the case that my character equals space, I guess we could have just neglected that, right? But if it's not the case that my character is a space, my capital letters plus equals 1. So I guess we probably could have just removed this boolean here. It's kind of redundant, but otherwise pass. So we're going to want to increment this variable if we don't have a space and if we don't have a lowercase letter. So hopefully that's clear to you how this logic works, but that would increment this variable 7 times, right? So we would get 7. printed on the console. So anyway, we can just go ahead and run the code now, and we can talk about it as the video progresses. So we're just going to enter a float, and I'm going to show you what happens there. But anyway, it says number of capital letters equals 7, because we say exec of print of number of capital letters, string of float of my capital letters. I just converted it to a float for fun. But it's all these data types working together, and we have to have an escape sequence because we're printing a string within the context of calling exec. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then we say cookie equals 52, print eval of cookie times 2. So that would be 104, because here cookie is going to be converted to its literal form. It's not going to be the word cookie. It's going to be the value of that variable. So 52 times 2 is 104. Same thing with 10 concatenated with times cookie, as long as it's an input to the eval function. Okay, but what if you say print of eval of cookie times 2? Okay, well then that would just be cookie. Okay, because you have the escape sequence. And then I entered a minute ago, I entered a number into the console, into the input, and I said 2.3 because it says print eval of float of input of enter a float please plus cookie. And so I entered 2.3, and so 52 plus 2.3 is 54.3. And then finally, exec of print of eval of 2 plus 1 would give 3. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then we can think about the arrays class, right? So A equals, and then we can have a tuple of tuples, right? And this time we're going to do it with strings, right? So for previous examples, we've talked about matrices where there are numbers that we can add together, find the maximum element of. But really, for any class that's sortable, we can come up with the minimum element or the maximum element. And for any class that has an add magic method, we can define what it means to add two instances of a class together. For any class that has a sub magic method, like we talked about in lesson 36, we can define what it means to subtract two instances of a class. But here we have two tuples of tuples, and each of the individual tuples has two strings in it, right? So A is a tuple of tuples. So it has apple and butter in the first tuple within it, and then cat and dog in the second tuple within it. And then B is another tuple of tuples with sauce, fly, and then fish and fish. And then we're going to say C equals arrays.sum matrix of A and B. And that would go ahead and concatenate those strings in the corresponding index positions together. This is a static method that we talked about in a previous video. And we have a doc string, and we have defined sum matrix of matrix 1 and matrix 2. And we say result is empty list. And then for K and range of length of matrix 1, new row equals empty list. For W and range of length of matrix 1 of 0, new row dot append of matrix 1 of KW plus matrix 2 of KW, result dot append of new row, return result. So that's how you would concatenate two strings together in each of the index positions, or how you would add two numbers together in each of the index positions. And the entry positions would have to agree with one another, but the matrix wouldn't have to all have the same values, right? So you would have to add two numbers together, but you wouldn't necessarily have to have numbers at all the positions in the grid, but they would have to line up between the two grids. So hopefully that's clear to you. And the difference matrix would work the same way. We just replace the plus sign with a minus sign, right? And then we have a minimum entry. So we could say min values is empty list for K and matrix, min values dot append of min of K, return min of min values, right? And the same thing for maximum entry, but we were just replace the word min with the word max, right? And then we can have the top left and the top right and the bottom left and the bottom right element. We just have to be careful about what index positions we're referencing within the list or tuple that, you know, represents our matrix, right? So is it matrix of 0, 0, or is it matrix of length of matrix 1 minus length of, or is it matrix of length of matrix minus 1, length of matrix of 0 minus 1, right? You have to be thinking about where in the grid you are. And then the number of entries we just said is the number of rows, which would be length of matrix 1 which times the number of columns, which is length of matrix 1 of 0. And then we talked about the transpose. So this is a class method with a class method decorator and a CLS as the first thing in the parentheses. It's not an input. It just indicates to Python that it's a class method rather than a static method or an instance method. But you would go ahead, this is the methodology, this is the architecture that we talked about in a previous video. Result equals empty list, A equals 0, while A is less than length of matrix 1 of 0, new row equals empty list. B equals 0, while B is less than length of matrix 1, new row dot append of matrix 1 of BA, B plus equals 1, result dot append of new row, A plus equals 1, return result. So hopefully you can follow that on your own or copy paste it or just understand conceptually how that works. and then all these things get printed, right? So where were we? So we could say print of C, right? Print arrays dot sum matrix of A and B. So that would just be applesauce, butterfly, catfish, dogfish, right? We could also print the top left, the top right, the bottom left, and bottom right elements of the sum matrix, right? And then we could also go ahead, I think that's the only example that I have, but you could also go ahead and do the transpose, right? So you could say print, we could just go ahead and do that quickly. So print arrays.transpose of C, right? And so that's calling the transpose method in the arrays class, right? It's a class method called transpose, right? And we're just going to enter a different float. So let's enter 2.0, and then now it says 54.0, right? Because it added cookie and 2.0 together to get 54.0. But if we scroll down, what do we get here? So then I kind of lost my train of thought. I'm just going to pause. This is where we were. So now it says applesauce, catfish, butterfly, dogfish, right? So it flips the rows and columns. So hopefully that's clear to you. What we're going to do in this video is we're going to talk about another module called JSON. Okay, so JSON is essentially a string with a dictionary inside of it. Okay, it's a dictionary that's wrapped inside of a string. And we're going to think about the JSON module and some functions that it provides and kind of how it operates. Because when you go into software engineering, a lot of times when people think about data, they'll store it in what's called a JSON object. And a lot of the times it's just a dictionary inside of a string or some data wrapped inside of a string. But we want to understand how to go ahead and work with this module. So what we're going to do is we're going to import the JSON module. But before we do that, we're just going to go ahead and study it. So we'll go to blackle.com, and you can go ahead and Blackle, you can go ahead and search JSON Python, right? And you would go ahead and click on the first link. And it's an encoder and decoder. So you can learn as much about it as you want, but we're going to learn about two methods, right? So there's essentially a dumps method, and then there's a loads method, right? And so we're going to click on the W3 schools, but there's basically a dumps method and a loads method, and it basically allows you to go back and forth between a Python dictionary and a string with a Python dictionary inside of it. So anyway, what we're going to do is we're going to import a particular module under a certain name, right? If we've already talked about how we can go ahead and import a module to use functions within it, right? We can say import m for some module m, and then we could call a function within it, right? So we could say m.f, and we could also import a specific function from a module, right? So if we say from m import f, then we could just call f within our program, right? And then you could also import a specific function and rename it for your program, right? So you could say from m import f as g, and then you could just call g. But another aspect of modules that we can say is that you can import a module and just rename it. So you could say import m as n, and then if you wanted to use a function in that module m, you would call n.f. So hopefully that's clear to you. So we import JSON as J, and we learn about two functions that the JSON class provides. So at the top of the class, make sure that you go ahead and have import JSON, right? But at least import JSON. But here I'm just saying that you can rename the module, and then you can call functions, but j.function, right? Rather than json.function. So hopefully that's clear to you, but there's two methods that we're going to study. So json.loads of s. So that accepts a string containing a dictionary and returns the dictionary. So we define a function called JSON object. So it accepts some s, right? So this function accepts a string s and returns the JSON object of it. So this is not a complete doc string because it doesn't have args and returns, but it just says return j.loads of s. So we're going to learn about what the loads function does within the JSON module. So if we say JSON string equals lambda w j.dumps of w. So what does the dumps function do? So the dumps function is sort of the opposite. So it accepts a dictionary w and returns the JSON string representation of it. And it turns out that the dumps function can actually accept things that are not dictionaries. So you could get the JSON string representation of an int or float by passing in an int or float. You could get the JSON string representation of a list or tuple by passing in a list or tuple. but it would come out as an array. So we can go ahead and talk about that. But we define two functions from lines 205 to 211, right? One of them is a regular function where we just return j.loads of s. So we're going to call the loads function from the JSON module on the input s that we passed into the JSON object function, right? And then JSON string is a lambda function that accepts an input w and returns j.dumps of w, or dumps is from the JSON module. And so here we have a string with a dictionary inside of it. So we're going to say print length of my JSON colon equals JSON object of my dictionary. So it assigns my JSON to JSON object of my dictionary, and it prints the length of it, right? And so we can go ahead and figure out that the length of it would be 3, right? Because there, or I guess it would be, where are we? So there would be 5, right? Because there are 5 key value pairs in this string that represents a dictionary after we use the loads function to convert it to a dictionary. And then we could say for k in my json.keys, if it's not the case that my dictionary.get of k is greater than or equal to 80, continue. And then exec of print of next value that's at least 80, string of my json.get of k. And so next value that's at least 80, 95. Next value that's at least 80, 85. So we converted the string to a dictionary using the loads function from the JSON module. So hopefully that's clear to you. And then we can also go the other way around. So we could say dict1. We can create a dictionary. I'm going to call it dict1. So there are some keys, right? So there's the key 5, and then there's the key string 5, right? And then there's the key 6 and the key string 6, right? And the values are 10, 11, 10, Hummer, and the summer. And there are 2 10s because we said the keys in the dictionary have to be unique, but the values in the dictionary don't have to be unique. So we say string 1 equals JSON string of dict1. And we said JSON string is a lambda function that returns the dumps of w, right, where dumps is from the JSON module, right? And so we could say print eval of, and then in quotes we have type of string 1, and that would tell us that that's in fact a string, right? It says class str, right? And then we could say print of string 1 dot upper, and so that would give us the string representation of the dictionary, but any lowercase letters would be converted to uppercase. And then we could say print length of string 1, and that would give us 56, because the length of this string, like if you wrote out this string, it would be 56, regardless of whether the letters were converted to uppercase or not. And then can we convert an int to a JSON string? Yes. So we would say eval of, and then in quotes, JSON string of int of 249 plus 1. So hopefully you can follow that. But we're converting a string to an int, and then we're converting that int back to a string, and then we're converting the string representation, we're evaluating it, but it stays as a string. And then we concatenate that string with this question, okay? And so it just says 250 after adding 1 to 249, but that's how the eval function works, and also how the dumps function works within the JSON module. So hopefully you can study this documentation. It's just on, blackhole.com. You type in JSON Python and click on the W3 schools link, right? And you have to import JSON, and then you can study and use these functions, right? And you can also convert a tuple to a string, and technically you can, right? But then we also say jtuple colon equals JSON string of my tuple colon equals 5299. So there are 2 walrus operators, right? Now we assign 2 variables and work with them at the same time. But here we're going to have a tuple, right? And then we're going to convert it to a string and assign that to a variable called jtuple. And it looks like we can do that, but it looks like there are square brackets here, and we usually associate that with a list. So in JSON, basically, we don't characterize lists and tuples. Basically, if we have a list or tuple in Python and we convert it to a JSON string, in either case, it returns an array, but an array in JSON has square brackets. And that's something that is a little more typical of Java, for example, is to have square brackets in its primary data structure. But then we could say exec of print of my tuple of 3 over 2, so the integer division of 9 with 2, so that would be 4, right? But then if we say exec of print of jtuple of my tuple of 3 over 2, well then that would look at the string representation of it, right? And then there's a 2 that exists there, so hopefully that's clear to you. And then print of can we convert a Boolean to a JSON string? And then it looks like it would be true, right? Because if you look at the documentation, the Python true has a capital T, but the JSON true has a lowercase t. But the point is that it would be returned as a string, right? And you can go ahead and try out different things here, right? You can go ahead and try doing different things with dictionary. There's also something that you can research on your own as a homework assignment or a suggestion for future learning, is that the dumps function can actually accept 2 keyword arguments called indent and separators, which would allow you to format the resultant JSON string in different ways. So you can go ahead and research that on your own, but hopefully that was interesting to you. That's the end of the Python curriculum. Hopefully you enjoyed it. From UMails03, thanks for watching, and please subscribe.